In just 9 minutes, a powerful American judge, adored by the media, mocked an African leader on live TV, only to find himself in handcuffs, exposed before the very world he thought he controlled. Ibrahim Traoré didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply placed a red folder on the bench and let the truth do the talking. The cameras were rolling. The world was watching. And justice, for once, wasn't scripted. But here's what you didn't see on the evening news. A courtroom built like a stage. A man brought in to be humiliated, who instead became a symbol of quiet resistance. This is not just a story about law and power. It's a story about what happens when silence becomes the loudest sound in the room. And though the characters and events you're about to witness are fictional, the injustice, the pain, the dignity, those emotions are very real, because sometimes fiction is the only way to tell the truth. This is the story of the red folder. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C. woke up differently that morning, not with sirens, not with breaking news, but with a quiet hum, like the city knew something was about to break and didn't dare interrupt it. Before dawn, the marble steps of the federal courthouse were already scrubbed clean, not for justice, but for the cameras. News vans lined the avenue like soldiers, tripods locked in, microphones tested, journalists rehearsed their serious faces. Inside, stage lights had been tested for hours, not overhead courtroom fluorescents, but studio-grade lighting, designed to make one man look noble and another look guilty. This wasn't a trial, this was a broadcast, and it had a headline ready before it even began. Outside the courthouse, a massive poster rippled in the wind. "Today, Africa answers to the West." The print was bold, elegant, and utterly damning, but below it, scribbled in permanent marker by someone brave, were smaller words no one wanted the cameras to catch. Or maybe, "Today the West answers to itself." Crowds began to gather, but not all of them came to witness justice. Some had been bussed in, fed with sandwiches, handed matching signs, "Justice for global victims." Most didn't know who Ibrahim Traoré was. One man even held his protest sign upside down. But the signs weren't the point. The optics were. On the judge's bench inside, a single bottle of premium water sat. Not for the accused, not for the press, just for Judge Whitaker, his desk glimmering under the soft glow of imported LEDs. He would arrive soon, polished, prepared, like he always did, like nothing could touch him. But this time, something would. At precisely 8:03 a.m., the crowd shifted. A single black vehicle, unmarked, slowed to a halt just outside the main steps. No police escort, no flashing lights, no entourage, just one man. The back door opened, and Ibrahim Traoré stepped out. Not a word was spoken, no cameras shouted his name, and yet, for a fleeting second, it felt like the air itself bent around him. He wore no medals, no symbols of office, only a dark, tailored suit, and in his left hand, clutched loosely, was a single object, a red folder, slim, silent, unremarkable at first glance. But somehow, it felt dangerous. Some whispered, others stared. One reporter, clutching her notepad, leaned to her cameraman. "That's it? No team? No security?" The cameraman shook his head, lens still trained on the folder. "That's not confidence. That's something else." Traoré walked with a calm that seemed out of place. Not the kind of calm that comes from ignorance. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what's coming and not being afraid of it. He climbed the courthouse steps alone. Every footstep echoed, not because it was loud, but because everyone else had fallen quiet. A protester dropped his sandwich. A reporter forgot to press record. Inside, one clerk paused mid-keystroke. Everyone could feel it. He wasn't just entering a courtroom. He was entering a trap. And yet, he didn't flinch. Why would a man walk into a trap with only a folder? Not a lawyer, not a briefcase, not even a whisper of support behind him. What was in that folder? And more terrifyingly, what if it wasn't just paper? What if it was proof? not of innocence, but of something far bigger, of corruption, of betrayal, of a system rigged to devour the ones who dared to speak without permission. What if that red folder wasn't a defense? What if it was a verdict? In that moment, as Traoré passed through the courthouse doors, the story the world thought it was about to hear, a tale of guilt, of scandal, of a fallen leader, started to tremble, because something about the way he walked said this trial wasn't just about him, it was about all of us. And the man in the velvet robe, the one with the headlines already drafted in his favor, he had no idea that the real judge had just entered the room. Judge Norman Whitaker didn't walk into his courtroom. He entered it like a man stepping onto a stage he had built with his own two hands. The doors swung open at exactly 8:12 a.m. Not a second too early, not a moment too late. A hush fell over the gallery. This wasn't reverence, it was choreography. He moved with the confidence of someone who expected the world to look at him, and the certainty that they would. His black judicial robe was tailored, but not subtle. The velvet shimmered faintly under the ceiling lights, hemmed just enough to catch the air as he walked, as though it were meant to flare behind him like a cape. The color? A shade darker than standard black. On camera, it would appear richer, more authoritative. He didn't look like a judge. He looked like a man playing a judge on television and loving every second of it. Whitaker had not always been this way. Once, long ago, there had been a young man who believed in the law. But that man had long since disappeared, buried under layers of fame, interviews, donor galas, and the sweet, sticky applause of cable news anchors. Now he was a brand, a former television legal analyst turned federal judge. Whitaker knew better than anyone that optics beat truth every time. His Instagram bio read, "Gavel goals, Constitution in motion." His last ruling had gone viral on TikTok, a 10-second clip of him dramatically adjusting his glasses and declaring, "Over," with style. Behind the bench, everything was arranged to his liking. His cushion had been fluffed by a junior staffer, so his posture would appear regal. His water bottle, sourced from Icelandic springs, sat slightly off-center, just enough to be seen in every wide shot. The microphone was custom-mounted to capture his voice at the perfect tone. Part gravitas, part game show host. Even his gavel was custom-made, a political gift engraved with, "Justice must be seen." Because that was the point. Justice to Whitaker wasn't blind, it was performative. He didn't just rule, he performed rulings. He didn't issue verdicts, he delivered monologues. And today, his audience wasn't just the press gallery behind bulletproof glass, it was the world. He looked down at his schedule, not the legal docket, but the camera angles. "Side A," he murmured to a clerk as he stepped behind the bench, "is my good side. Light from left, mic up slightly." The clerk nodded, used to it. They all were. He rehearsed his posture more than he read the case files. He had pre-selected reactions ready to go, depending on how the cameras rolled. Smirk, frown, disappointed nod, quizzical brow. All practiced in 3 mirrors back in his dressing room. Sorry, office. The real goal today was not to deliberate, it was to humiliate. Ibrahim Traoré had been cast not as a defendant, but as a villain. Not in a court of law, but in a story written, rehearsed, and approved by publicists long before the folder touched the courtroom floor. The prosecution's job wasn't to prove guilt, it was to frame a man, preferably Lev, preferably with sound bites. And Whitaker? He was the star. He imagined the headline already spinning in digital newsrooms. Judge Whitaker schools African strongman in courtroom showdown. Justice served and streamed. A masterclass in Western accountability. He smiled to himself. This would be good for ratings, good for fundraising, good for future offers. Perhaps a second book deal or that HBO docuseries he'd been teasing. The clerk leaned in, whispered, "Mr. Traoré has arrived." Whitaker nodded, slow and deliberate. He tapped his pen twice against the bench, a subtle cue to his staff. "Cue camera 3, close up ready." Then he leaned back, adjusted his cuffs, and grinned. He wasn't here to weigh evidence. He was here to deliver a moment, a televised reckoning, a spectacle, a lesson to the world. And the lesson was simple. You don't challenge this system without being made an example. What Whitaker didn't realize, what no one in that room yet understood, was that he was about to become the example. Because this trial wasn't written by him. Not today, not anymore. When Ibrahim Traoré entered the courtroom, no one stood. The judge didn't rise. The bailiff didn't announce him. There were no murmurs of protocol, no acknowledgement of his position, his past, or his presence. Just silence, sharp and unnatural, like a room trying too hard not to breathe. Traoré walked past the rows of onlookers and journalists, each of them waiting to dissect his posture, his suit, his expression. But he gave them nothing. He didn't look left or right. His eyes were fixed ahead, his pace steady. When he reached the defendant's table, he placed the red folder down, not with force, but with precision, and then he sat. No adjustment, no hesitation, no search for cues or permission. He was exactly where he intended to be. Whitaker watched him like a cat studying a mouse that didn't run. He cleared his throat, loudly, and leaned forward, adjusting his microphone with 2 fingers. "Mr. Traoré," he said, stretching the syllables as if savoring them, "I trust you understand that in this courtroom, we do not run things the way you might be accustomed to." He smiled, then turned ever so slightly to glance at the gallery, playing to the cameras now in full record. His voice, rich and performative, carried just the right mix of condescension and charm. "Here, justice is measured, fair and blind, as it should be, not decided in back rooms or through dusty parades." A few stifled chuckles fluttered from the back. "Here, we don't settle disputes with drums and dances. We settle them with order." And there it was, the line, the moment rehearsed to provoke, to reduce, to remind. But it didn't land the way Whitaker expected. The chuckles died quickly, replaced by a tension so subtle it felt like the room itself exhaled. Traoré didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He didn't even shift in his seat. His hands rested gently on the red folder, still closed, still waiting. He looked at Whitaker not with anger nor defiance, but with a silence that somehow made the judge's words feel smaller in their echo. The judge's smile faltered, just slightly. He pressed on, as if to reclaim momentum. "You may have led people in your country, Mr. Traoré," he said, tone tightening, "but here, you are not a leader. You are a defendant, and today you will learn what real justice looks like." Again, nothing. No indignation, no rebuttal. Just that same unbroken stillness. A cameraman adjusted his focus, trying to zoom in on something. Anything. A twitch, a tremble, a sign of weakness. But there was none. Instead, the power in the room began to tilt, almost imperceptibly, like water slowly receding before a wave. No one knew why they felt it, but they did. This man was not behaving like a guilty man, or a desperate one, or a puppet waiting for his strings to move. He was waiting, yes, but not for mercy, and not for permission. He was waiting for the right moment. And Whitaker, whether he realized it or not, had just given it to him. The first blow had landed, but not the one the judge intended. Long before the courtroom cameras were aimed at his face, long before his name became a whispered headline across continents, Ibrahim Traoré sat beneath a mango tree, sipping bitter tea from a clay cup, listening, truly listening to the people who had nothing left to lose. It was in a small village just outside Ouagadougou. No microphones, no news crews, only elders, school teachers, farmers, and youth, gathered in a circle to talk about how to rebuild a country torn between coups and contracts. That evening, the air was thick with dust and honesty. No one was there to perform. No one interrupted. He liked it that way. 30 minutes after the last cup of tea was poured, Traoré collapsed. At first, the doctors called it dehydration. The sun had been unforgiving, and he hadn't eaten all day. But something felt off. His vision blurred in pulses. His chest didn't ache. It tightened, like something was crawling inside it. His hearing dimmed, replaced by a low static hum, as if his body was trying to tell him a secret in a language made of pain. The lab results arrived 3 days later. Polonium, a radioactive agent so rare, so expensive, that its presence said more than any investigation ever could. This wasn't a message from local rivals. This was international, professional, political. His aides panicked. Some cried. A few quietly disappeared. But Traoré stayed still. He asked for the names of the villagers who'd attended, asked if any had shown symptoms. They hadn't. The tea had been brought to him directly, by a diplomatic courier, sealed, personal, trusted. But trust, he realized, was the easiest thing to poison. The source? A consultant tied to Onyx Global, masked beneath layers of subcontracted diplomatic staff. No fingerprints, no direct threat, just the unspoken expectation that men like him don't last long. He said nothing publicly, no outrage, no press conference, no retaliation. He simply lived and remembered. Now sitting in the courtroom thousands of miles from that mango tree, his posture was the same, unshaken, controlled, present, but not loud. That was the part the world never understood. That silence was not absence. That stillness was not surrender. Traoré had come to believe in something that made politicians uncomfortable and pundits impatient. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand. It was a lesson he learned not through philosophy, but survival. Every time someone had tried to silence him, through poison, pressure, or propaganda, he didn't shout back. He outlasted them, because shouting could be dismissed. But consistency, stillness, dignity, those things lingered, and that frightened them more than fire ever could. He'd watched empires sell justice in gilded packages, watched as corrupt deals were signed in clean suits under clean lights, while entire communities drowned in mine runoff. He'd seen truth buried beneath paperwork and then wrapped in legality like a corpse in silk. So he chose a different path. He chose the long game. He trained himself to wait, to observe, to collect facts like a farmer collects seeds, not for show, but for the right season. And when it came, he would plant them where they could no longer be ignored, not in debates, not in backroom negotiations, but in places like this, a courtroom designed to humiliate him, watched by millions where silence would feel like weakness until it wasn't. When he looked at Judge Whitaker, he didn't see a man of law. He saw a man playing a role, a performer, a salesman. And salesmen fear only one thing, a customer who doesn't react. That's why Traoré didn't blink. That's why he didn't answer the insult. That's why his hand rested unbothered on the red folder. He wasn't hiding his anger. He had simply outgrown it. Because Ibrahim Traoré was not just a man with secrets. He was a man who knew that secrets, like poison, only work in the dark. And today, everything was under lights. The folder landed with a sound so small it should have disappeared beneath the shuffle of papers and the distant hum of cameras. Yet everyone heard it, a faint, precise tap against polished wood, like the first drop of rain on a roof before a storm breaks. Traoré did not slam it, did not brandish it like evidence or threat. He simply set it down in front of him, square, deliberate, perfectly aligned with the edge of the defense table. The red cover, matte and unadorned, seemed to absorb the court's fluorescent light, turning every other object dull by comparison. Seconds stretched. Court staff, who had been trained to hide all emotion, paused mid-breath. A stenographer hovered above her keys, uncertain whether to capture a silence that suddenly felt important. From the gallery, a murmur started, too soft to register as speech, more an involuntary exhale of collective curiosity, then cut off when a bailiff raised a cautionary hand. Judge Whitaker, who moments earlier had commanded the room with practiced ease, leaned forward as though squinting might grant him X-ray vision. He adjusted his glasses, performance or habit, nobody could tell, then shot the clerk a look that said, "Find out what that is." The clerk did not move. His gaze was fixed on the folder's crimson spine, pupils narrowing the way one stares at a thin sliver of flame in a darkened room, mesmerized and vaguely afraid. A producer in the media pen gestured frantically to her cameraman, index finger making tight circles. Zoom, zoom, until the lens drew so close that the folder's fabric texture filled every home viewer's screen. What millions saw was the simplest of objects. No seal, no name, no emblem. Yet it radiated the unmistakable energy of something meant to be opened only when it is too late to look away. The prosecutor cleared his throat, an awkward papery sound. "Your Honor," he began, trying to reel the moment back into procedure, "may we remind the defendant that all exhibits must be—" Whitaker silenced him with a raised palm, never breaking eye contact with the man who now sat serenely behind that strip of red. It wasn't defiance Whitaker sensed. It was preparation, like the stillness of a diver poised on a platform, waiting for just the right beat before gravity takes over. He tapped his gavel once, not for order, but to hear something in the room answer him. Nothing did. Traoré's face, framed by the tight camera shot, remained an unmoving study in patience. No twitch, no flicker betrayed the adrenaline any normal human would feel beneath the scrutiny of lights and international judgment. The absence of fear where fear was expected created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured speculation. What if those pages hold proof no one can spin? Contracts, wire transfers. Worse, the mind of every spectator, journalist, even security officer leapt to fill the void. Each thought darker, heavier than the last. Ellis, the young clerk who had fluffed the judge's cushion that morning, took a half step back. He told himself it was because the AC vent blew cold directly onto his neck, yet the chill that crept through him came from somewhere else. The sudden, undeniable suspicion that the whole proceeding might not be a show after all, but a reckoning, and that the folder on the table was its opening salvo. A bead of sweat trickled behind his ear. He wiped it quickly, hoping no one noticed. Across the aisle, a veteran reporter with decades of war zone experience whispered into her recorder. Voice trembling with excitement she hadn't felt in years. "Defendant presents unknown dossier. Courtroom tension extreme. Judge appears unsettled." She stopped, realizing unsettled did not capture what she saw in Whitaker's eyes. It wasn't mere unease. It was the dawning awareness that the narrative he'd rehearsed might already be slipping from his grip, rewritten by a man who hadn't said a word. In the stillness, the question formed, an unspoken headline pulsing above every seat. What's inside the folder? Paper? Evidence? A confession? A trap? More unsettling was the possibility that its power lay not in contents but in timing, that whatever slept between those red covers would wake only when Whitaker, and the system behind him, were most exposed. Traoré didn't lift the folder, didn't slide it forward, didn't even rest a possessive hand on top. He simply allowed it to exist in plain sight, daring the courtroom to confront its own anticipation. At last he looked up, meeting Whitaker's gaze with a calm that felt less like resistance and more like invitation. "Go on, continue your performance." Behind that look was a promise. The folder would speak when it chose, and when it did, no gavel could drown it out. Until then, silence would play the drumbeat, and every heartbeat in the chamber would keep time. At first it was subtle, so subtle it could have been mistaken for a draft in the air conditioning or the flicker of an overhead light. But the room had changed, something had shifted, and those attuned to human tension, the bailiffs, the court reporters, the clerks, felt it first. Ellis, seated just off to the left of Judge Whitaker's bench, blinked twice and stared down at his notepad. He hadn't written a word in nearly 4 minutes. His pen hovered uselessly over the paper, frozen above a line that read, "Defense remains silent." He looked up again, studying Traoré, then glancing toward the judge, as if trying to recalibrate some moral compass inside him that had suddenly gone off course. Something about the scene no longer matched the script. Ellis had read the prep brief the night before. He knew how this was supposed to go. The arrogant foreign leader, stripped of power, humbled by a Western courtroom and a Western gavel. There were even suggested pull quotes ready for press distribution. But the man in front of him wasn't following the script, and neither was the room. Judge Whitaker, however, refused to acknowledge the tonal shift. If anything, he doubled down. "You know," the judge said, voice slick with sarcasm, "it really is remarkable that someone with no formal legal education, no understanding of Western jurisprudence, believes he can sit there with a folder and call it a defense." He chuckled loudly and alone. Then he stood, theatrically stepping down from the bench to circle around the courtroom like a lecturer. I assume you prepared that yourself? Or did someone help you between goat herding sessions? This time the laughter didn't come. At best, a few dry exhales. A cameraman frowned behind his lens. A journalist shifted uncomfortably in her seat. One of the spectators whispered something to her neighbor, but the sound was swallowed by silence. Ellis looked around and realized no one was smiling anymore. Even those who had come expecting a spectacle, a takedown, began to feel a different kind of discomfort. This wasn't justice. It wasn't accountability. It was a man in a robe taunting someone who refused to taunt back. Traoré still hadn't moved. His hands remained calmly on the table, just beside the red folder. His eyes, quiet and unreadable, followed Whitaker's movements like a hawk follows a storm. Not afraid of it, but alert to where it might land. He didn't clench his jaw, didn't raise a brow, didn't breathe heavier. He simply existed, utterly unshaken. And that, more than anything, unsettled the room. Ellis felt it in his chest first. Not admiration, not sympathy, but shame. Not because he had said anything wrong, but because he hadn't said anything at all. His job, like everyone else's, was to stay neutral. But what was neutrality in the face of open degradation? The oxygen in the room thickened. Whitaker, still circling, now found his voice cracking ever so slightly at the edges. He tossed out another barb, something about tribal courts and fairy tales. But even he seemed to realize it wasn't landing. Not anymore, because everyone in that courtroom had just begun to understand something. This man's silence wasn't weakness. It was discipline. It was armor. It was a mirror. And everything Whitaker hurled at him, it was only reflecting back on himself. The silence had stretched so long it began to take shape. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore. It was presence. Heavy, watchful, dense. Every person in the room could feel it pressing against their skin. Even the walls, once echo chambers for Whitaker's voice, now seemed to listen. And then, after nearly 20 minutes of silence, Ibrahim Traoré spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't signal his turn. He simply spoke, like a stone being dropped into still water, soft but undeniable. "Your robe may be clean," he said, "but your hands are not." The words hung in the air like smoke, curling slowly through the room before anyone dared to breathe again. No one moved, not the bailiff, not the gallery, not even the judge. For a brief, stunning moment, it was as if the trial had reversed, as though the accused had become the one doing the judging and everyone else had been called to answer. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried with it the clarity of someone who had waited until the precise moment when words mattered more than volume. Across the room, the court reporter's fingers hesitated for half a beat before resuming. A journalist blinked slowly, her pen frozen just above her notebook. The cameraman adjusted his focus instinctively, zooming in closer, desperate to capture the expression that had not changed, yet now meant something very different. Whitaker blinked. Once, twice. Then, almost too quickly, he laughed. It was a sharp, awkward sound, one that bounced off the walls but failed to stick. He leaned back slightly, tapping his pen against the armrest like a conductor unsure how to continue the symphony. "Is that so?" he replied, voice strained with performative incredulity. "And what exactly would you know about my hands, Mr. Traoré?" But the judge's grin didn't hold. It flickered, the way candlelight does when the air changes. Traoré said nothing more. He didn't elaborate, didn't argue, didn't attempt to take control of the moment. He just watched. And somehow that watchfulness spoke louder than any defense ever could. It was the kind of silence that unnerves men who are used to dominating rooms. A silence not of fear, but of knowing. A silence with weight and shape and aim. Ellis, still behind the judge's bench, stared down at his hands and realized, without quite knowing why, that they were trembling. The gallery, too, was shifting, no longer leaning forward in expectation, but now sitting back in unease. People who had come to witness a fall were now watching a reckoning. They were beginning to sense that the man in the velvet robe might not be the only one holding power in this room. Whitaker adjusted his glasses again, an unconscious tic now more nervous than rehearsed. "You're very confident for someone in your position," he said, trying to reassert control. But confidence doesn't win cases. Evidence does. Still no answer from Traoré. The folder remained closed. His fingers rested near it, not clutching, not defensive, just ready. And in that readiness was a warning. He had not come to plead. He had come to reveal. Whitaker tapped his gavel once, hard. "This courtroom will proceed under proper decorum," he declared, voice louder now, aimed more at the gallery than the man before him. "Grandstanding will not be tolerated." But no one clapped. No one nodded. Even the cameras seemed to pull back, as if unsure which way the story was now facing. Because in a trial built to humiliate a man, something unexpected had happened. The man refused to perform, and in doing so, he made everyone else's performance painfully visible. Whitaker leaned forward again, lips parting to fire another line, but paused. Traoré was still looking at him, calm, patient, certain. And in that moment, the judge felt something he hadn't in years. Not challenge, not defiance, but danger. The kind of danger that comes not from a man with power, but from a man who has nothing left to lose, except the truth. And he had just started to speak. The red folder had been sitting in plain sight for nearly half an hour, like a quiet storm waiting for its moment. And now, with the room taut as wire, and the judge still bristling from Traoré's piercing words, that moment had come. Without a word, without even adjusting his seat, Ibrahim Traoré slowly reached for the folder. The gesture was unremarkable. No drama, no ceremony, yet it felt like the room collectively inhaled and forgot how to exhale. His fingers touched the edge with calm certainty, and he flipped the cover open. The sound it made was soft, nearly imperceptible, a whisper of truth unfurling. He lifted the first page. The paper, white and pristine, bore a header in small black print. Onyx Global. Internal transaction summary. Confidential. No gas. Not yet. Only the sound of shifting postures and tightening jaws. He didn't read from it. He didn't announce its content. He simply turned it toward the bench, toward Whitaker, and placed it neatly in front of him. One page, then the second. A legal contract, a shell company registered in Delaware, attached to a consulting firm with no employees, no website, and one listed board member, E.N. Whitaker. A few murmurs began to stir from the gallery. The court reporter, for the first time that morning, stopped typing, not from fatigue, but from disbelief. Her fingers hovered, eyes flicked from the page to the judge's face. Then came the third page, a copy of an overseas wire transfer. Large figures, a date, a recipient, the account tied to a law firm in the British Virgin Islands. The name listed under the transaction, Whitaker's son-in-law. That was when it started. Whitaker leaned forward, slightly too fast. He picked up the first page with deliberate slowness, as if the extra care would somehow undo what it said. He scanned it, lips moving just barely. His expression, long trained in the art of courtroom neutrality, began to fray. Not collapse yet, but fray. His jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened, his fingers pressed just a little too hard against the corner of the page. Then came page 4. This one hit harder. It was an email thread sourced from a leak inside Onyx Global. No signature needed. The content was enough. A casual internal exchange between executives discussing court risks in West Africa. And then one line, casual, damning, ugly. "Whitaker's still our best insurance policy stateside. He'll kill anything that gets too close to the Cobalt leases." The judge froze, not visibly, not dramatically, but something behind his eyes blinked and didn't unblink. The gallery went utterly silent. Even the photographers stopped snapping. Somewhere in the press row, a veteran political correspondent dropped her pen. Literally, it clattered on the floor, but no one looked down. They were all looking at him. Whitaker, not the judge, not the host, not the authority. A man, just a man now, staring at paper he had never expected to see in public light. And Traoré, still silent, still steady. He turned the next page, then the next. Each document placed carefully, rhythmically, like bricks being laid around a man trapped inside his own house of mirrors. Traoré wasn't building an argument. He was unbuilding a myth. piece by piece. Whitaker tried to recover. He let out a forced laugh, short, clipped. The kind of sound a man makes when he's trying to pretend gravity is optional. Anyone can print fake documents, he muttered. This is nonsense. His voice betrayed him. It wasn't firm. It wobbled. He turned to Ellis, the clerk. Verify these, now. But Ellis didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the email, on that one line. Our best insurance policy stateside. He knew that phrase wasn't just unfortunate, it was the quiet confession of something much worse. And he couldn't unhear it. Neither could anyone else. The courtroom, once eager for humiliation, was now watching a slow-motion confession, delivered not with fists or fury, but with paper and poise. Traoré placed the final page down. The folder was now empty. The table before him held a mosaic of truth, each square sharper than any spoken word. He folded his hands. Still no smile, still no speech, because he didn't need to say it. The evidence was already louder than anything Whitaker could shout. And for the first time that day, the judge didn't look like a man waiting to pass judgment. He looked like a man waiting for it. For a few long seconds, there was only the sound of breathing, tight, uneven, thick with something unspoken. Whitaker still clutched the email page as though he could crumple it into fiction. His eyes darted from the document to the courtroom, as if searching for an ally, a cue, a lifeline. But what he found instead was silence. No nods from the media pit, no support from the gallery, no rehearsed reactions from his staff. Just a room watching a man who had long orchestrated spectacles suddenly caught in one, without a script. Then quietly from behind the bench came movement. Ellis stood. The clerk had always blended into the background, an efficient shadow, diligent, unremarkable, invisible by design. But now as he stepped forward into the space between the judge and the accused, the air shifted again. Not with drama, not with noise, but with a slow and irreversible gravity. In his hand, a small, silver USB drive. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't glance at the cameras. He didn't look at Traoré. His eyes were locked on one man, and one man only. Sir, he said softly but steadily, I can't protect you anymore. The words fell like a stone into water, rippling through every soul in the courtroom. Whitaker blinked, lips parting, but no words came. Not yet. Ellis extended the drive and placed it gently on the bench. It's all there, he continued. Emails, transfers, internal memos. The original documents. The things you thought no one would ever see. Whitaker took a half step back, hand still clutching the paper like a lifeline unraveling in his grip. I leaked the files, Ellis said. Then after a pause that felt like the world catching its breath, I used to believe in you. That sentence, simple, almost whispered, hit harder than all the damning evidence combined, because it didn't come from an accuser. It didn't come from a rival or an enemy. It came from within, from someone who had once looked up to him, trusted him, followed him, and in that moment every person watching didn't feel outrage. They felt something deeper. They felt the hollow echo of betrayal. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman covered her mouth. A journalist lowered her camera, eyes wet. One of the junior clerks turned away. Not because Traoré had proven something, but because Whitaker had lost something far more devastating than a case. He lost faith, the kind that takes years to build and seconds to destroy. The judge opened his mouth again, but what came out wasn't defense. It was disbelief. Why? He asked, barely audible. Ellis didn't hesitate. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. Because this was never justice, he said. It was theater, and I can't be part of it anymore. Whitaker looked at the drive on the bench, then at Ellis, then out toward a room full of faces that no longer feared or followed him. Only one face held stillness, and that was Ibrahim Traoré, seated, unmoved, unshaken, the folder now empty, the truth now spoken. The trial hadn't ended, but something far more important had, the illusion. The USB drive still sat on the bench like a silent verdict. The room hadn't moved, not a breath out of place, not a shoe scuffed. It was as if time itself held its breath. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a quiet firmness. Two men entered. Not in uniforms, not in tactical gear. No spectacle. Just plain black suits, No ties, federal credentials clipped to their jackets. They didn't rush. They didn't speak. They walked with the calm, rehearsed confidence of people who knew what they carried was final. They were from the office of the Inspector General. As they approached, a ripple moved through the courtroom, barely perceptible but undeniable. The bailiff turned instinctively. One of the suited men leaned close, whispered something into his ear. The bailiff stiffened. Then he nodded. Across the bench, Judge Whitaker was still standing, pale, lips parted, as though the world around him had suddenly become surreal. His eyes flicked between Ellis, the USB, the red folder, and the men in black. The bailiff stepped forward, and in a tone that seemed almost out of place for its softness, he spoke. "Your Honor, you are requested for immediate questioning by the Inspector General's office. There is now a formal inquiry." For a heartbeat, Whitaker stood frozen. "Excuse me?" he managed to say, voice cracking slightly. This is absurd." The second agent reached into his inner coat pocket, calmly producing a document. Not a speech, not an argument, just a printed, signed order with sharp federal lettering at the top. Federal arrest authorization, corruption and obstruction of international justice. He held it out toward the bench. Someone in the press gallery gasped. The microphones, still live, caught every word, every breath. Whitaker stared at the document. His hands refused to move toward it, like the ink might burn him. His voice, once the booming centerpiece of this courtroom, had now grown quiet, desperate, fragmented. No, this isn't how this works. I'm the judge." But the room didn't answer him, not even with silence. It just watched. The agents didn't raise their voices, they didn't draw weapons. They simply waited, not because they lacked urgency, but because they no longer needed permission. Whitaker reached for the gavel on instinct. That reflex, that centuries-old symbol of finality and power, was now a hollow gesture. His fingers grasped the wooden handle and lifted it halfway, then paused. It slipped. The gavel fell from his grip. A soft wooden clack echoed off the floor. Small, undramatic. And yet it landed heavier than anything that had come before. That sound, not of order, but of collapse. Not of judgment, but of a man watching his authority roll away from him. One of the agents stepped forward. "You will come with us, sir." Quietly. Whitaker looked out at the courtroom. Once they would have risen for him. Now not a single person stood, not in protest, not in deference, just stillness. Even Ellis wouldn't meet his eyes, especially Ellis. "This is madness," Whitaker whispered. But no one responded, because deep down even he didn't believe it anymore. The handcuffs emerged next, not with a clang, but with a soft metallic click that sounded strangely dignified in the air. The cuffs closed around his wrists. No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't a victory anyone felt like celebrating, because this wasn't justice done, it was justice revealed. As the agents turned him away from the bench, his robe swayed slightly behind him. The hem that once flowed like velvet had become a drag. The cape of a fallen actor, leaving a stage he no longer owned. Behind him, the gavel still lay on the floor, and in front of him, the doors swung open, not for his entrance, but for his exit. A camera clicked once, then again, and in the back of the courtroom, someone finally whispered, "It's done." But it wasn't, because as Judge Whitaker was led away in silence, the world outside was just beginning to listen. Silence flooded the courtroom, but it was not the hush of fear that hangs over a place after violence, nor the embarrassed quiet that follows an awkward joke. This was something rarer, the stillness of shared recognition, the moment when a room full of strangers realizes they have witnessed a hinge in history swing open. No one spoke, yet everyone understood that the story they had come to watch, a televised chastening of a foreign leader, had inverted itself before their eyes. The very oxygen felt thicker, weighted by the knowledge that power had changed hands without a single shout, a single fist, or even a single step forward. It had changed hands in the space between two sentences and the soft click of handcuffs. Judge Whitaker was gone now, led through the side door like a stage prop striking itself, his velvet robe dragging a muted line across the floor. Reporters who had prepared biting summaries of his triumph stared at blank screens, fingers hovering over keys, unsure how to narrate what they felt rather than what they had planned to say. Camera crews kept rolling but refrained from speaking. Nothing they could whisper to the control room would match the gravity of what the lens had already captured. Even the bailiffs, men trained to project stoic authority, seemed momentarily humbled, their usual posture of command replaced by an almost reverent poise. Arms behind backs, eyes down, as if the courtroom had become a sanctuary. At the center of that hush sat Ibrahim Traoré. He did not smile. He did not lean back in the theatrical relief. His shoulders remained squared, hands loosely laced on the table's edge. The red folder lay empty, its contents scattered like quiet thunder across the judge's bench, each page a detonated secret. Yet Traoré regarded them with no triumph, as though their purpose was never victory but revelation. He waited, head bowed slightly as if giving the room permission to breathe again. Only when he sensed that breath return did he rise. There was nothing hurried in the way he stood. Every movement seemed measured to avoid disturbing the fragile dignity that had settled over the chamber. He gathered the now hollow folder, closed it with a gentle press of his palm, and placed it under one arm. Then he turned toward the gallery, meeting eyes without lingering, offering neither apology nor condemnation, only acknowledgement. Some spectators, faces still flushed with the shock of betrayal, found themselves nodding back, not to the man, but to what he had proven possible. Traoré stepped away from the defense table, shoes tapping softly on marble. The sound was steady, deliberate, almost ceremonial, and it filled the room the way a bell once filled ancient courts, not loud but resonant, a reminder that something larger than protocol had transpired. As he reached the rear aisle, a reporter raised her camera instinctively, but her finger froze above the shutter. To capture the moment felt intrusive, as if photographing a prayer. He paused at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe. Without turning, his voice carried, low, even, unmistakable. It was never about me. The sentence hovered, neither boast nor lament, but a simple declaration of scope. The folder had never been armor for a single man. It was a mirror held up to a system that had forgotten how to see itself. In that instant, jurists and janitors, clerks and correspondents, all felt the boundary between observer and participant blur. They were witnessing the rebirth of an idea they had long ago relegated to mottos engraved on courthouses, that truth, when placed firmly on the table, could rearrange the hierarchy of an entire room. Traoré pulled the door open. No bailiff helped him. He did not need assistance. The heavy panel swung outward with a quiet creak, revealing the corridor beyond, bright, sunlit, almost startling after the chamber's orchestrated gloom. He did not look back. He did not close the door. He simply walked through, leaving a gap that seemed to invite the world to follow. Light spilled over the threshold in a pale rectangle, stretching across the polished floor like a path newly revealed. People did not speak. They listened to the echo of his footsteps diminishing down the hall. Somewhere outside, beyond the courthouse walls, horns blared in distant traffic, and birds argued on telephone wires, life resuming, unaware it had just been granted new context. Inside, the silence remained, but it was evolving. It was no longer the tight, uncomfortable silence of anticipation. It was spacious, reflective, the hush of a theater after the final curtain, when the audience stays seated, processing what the performance has asked of them. In that room, anyone searching for a hero found instead an invitation. Stand up, leave the door ajar, let the light in. The gavel could rest where it had fallen. It belonged to yesterday. What mattered now was the open doorway, the empty folder, and the echo of a soft voice reminding them that justice had never been about the man who spoke it, but about the truth he refused to bury. And somewhere, just beyond the threshold, the hinges of a larger world began to creak, unlocked at last. It began like the smallest of sparks, a change in a headline, a note of hesitation in a familiar anchor's voice. Less than an hour after Judge Whitaker was led away in cuffs, the story that had been pre-written by the world's press began to unravel before their eyes. CNN had scheduled their banner in advance, "Defiant Leader Faces Justice in U.S. Courtroom." By noon, the editors had quietly swapped it for shocking courtroom turn, African president presents corruption evidence against federal judge. The BBC had aired a 90-second segment with footage of Traoré walking into court, pairing it with a stern voiceover about democratic accountability. By that evening, they re-aired the same clip, but now paired it with a single sentence. Sometimes the one on trial isn't the one in chains. Al Jazeera's live blog, which had followed the trial moment by moment, saw its traffic triple in under 4 hours. The line, "Mr. President, you are not in Africa anymore," once tweeted by Western pundits with smug irony, was now being quoted with shame, then deleted en masse. And yet it was not the media's pivot that carried the story into the bloodstream of global consciousness. It was the people. In a classroom on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, a teacher asked her students to draw what courage looks like. A boy raised his hand and said, "Can I draw the red folder?" She smiled, and he did. Not a man's face, not a judge's bench, but a crimson rectangle clutched in a calm hand. Around it, he added tiny lightning bolts. "It's the folder that made the thunder," he explained. In Ghana, a radio host opened his morning show with a clip of Traoré's voice. Calm, deliberate. "It was never about me." He played it twice. Then he stayed silent for 30 full seconds on live air. When he spoke again, his voice cracked as he said, "May we raise sons who speak like this, and judges who cannot be bought." In Harlem, a spoken-word poet named Mira T stepped onto a dim stage at a weekly open mic. She stood in silence for 10 seconds before raising her eyes to the crowd. They mocked his accent. They mocked his suit. They mocked that he came alone. But truth doesn't shout. It arrives dressed in silence, and it waits for you to listen. The room erupted, not just in applause, but in something more raw. Recognition, pain, relief. A woman in the back row whispered, "I've waited my whole life to hear something like that." On TikTok, millions replayed the clip of the gavel falling from Whitaker's hand. They layered it with music, some with jazz, others with orchestral crescendos, and captioned it, "The Day the Mask Slipped." In Paris, a mural appeared overnight on a brick wall near Gare de Lyon, a simple portrait of a man in a dark suit, head slightly bowed, a red folder glowing in his arm. Above it, spray-painted in white, "Truth doesn't shout, it stands." The phrase became a rallying cry, quiet, almost sacred. Not viral in the usual way. No gimmicks, no slogans, just a line repeated like prayer. And perhaps the most telling detail of all, in Washington, the courthouse where it all began found a new kind of visitor. Not journalists or lawyers, but strangers. People who stood outside and looked up, not at the architecture, but at the idea. Not at who fell, but at what finally stood up. Justice had not triumphed. It had been remembered. And across continents, languages, and timelines, it was now being carried, not by institutions, but by people who had been waiting patiently to believe in it again. Long before the red folder ever touched the judge's bench, long before the cameras turned to him in stunned silence, Ibrahim Traoré had already stared into the mouth of death and chosen to live not just for himself, but for a principle. That moment didn't happen in a courtroom or under the watchful eyes of journalists. It happened in the shade of a mango tree, in the dry outskirts of a village near Ouagadougou, with no audience but the wind and a few weary elders. That evening had been quiet, too quiet. Traoré had spent the day listening, truly listening to teachers, farmers, women who carried water 10 kilometers a day. They didn't speak in slogans. They didn't complain with raised fists. They asked questions like, why does our land give diamonds but our children go barefoot? And who signs away a river for a road we'll never drive? Traoré had answered the way a soldier answers the mother of a fallen comrade, honestly but with grief. Because the ones who take, he said, don't always carry guns. They carry contracts. Later that night, the tea came as it always did, served by a trusted aide, brewed the way he liked it, hot, bitter, strong. But 30 minutes after the first sip, something shifted. His vision blurred, the ground tilted, and his chest grew tight like it had been wrapped in invisible wire. His security rushed him to a private clinic. The doctors called it heat exhaustion, perhaps dehydration. But his intelligence team knew better. The test came back quietly, secretly. Trace elements of polonium, an assassin's signature. Rare, expensive, almost impossible to detect unless you knew to look. Not enough to kill immediately, but enough to make him vanish in slow, quiet failure. A leader who couldn't show up. A voice no longer trusted. A distraction conveniently removed from the chessboard of global economics. The source? A sealed diplomatic pouch, delivered 2 days earlier through an intermediary tied to a consulting branch of Onyx Global. That was the moment everything changed. Not because he survived, but because he wasn't surprised. He had read enough leaked memos, heard enough unnamed offers, met enough foreign donors in five-star hotel rooms offering development incentives wrapped in velvet threats. What he realized under that mango tree was this: they didn't need to kill him, they only needed him to stay quiet. And that's when he made a choice. He didn't order an investigation, didn't issue a press release. He simply remembered. And then he wrote. For months, he began tracing shell companies and offshore accounts in his free time. No lawyers, no bureaucrats, just his own determination and a single question burning through every late-night search. How deep does this go? The answer was darker than even he imagined. What he uncovered wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a business model, a pattern. Companies like Onyx Global didn't bribe. They invested. In silence, in fear, in fatigue. They didn't need governments to fall, just to stall. They didn't need leaders to die, only to doubt themselves long enough to step aside. And in a sleek Nairobi hotel room months later, they made it official. 3 men in tailored suits, briefcases in hand, offered what they called a dignified exit. Inside, $50 million in offshore bonds, tax-free, untraceable. Step aside, they said. Let the market stabilize. Be a statesman, not a martyr. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He stood, looked them each in the eye and said, "My people are poor because men like you have been rich for too long." Then he walked out. No one followed, but from that moment on, he knew what was coming. The slander, the diplomatic cold shoulders, the legal traps, the trials not meant to convict, but to erase. And still, he chose to walk forward. Because Traoré understood something men in suits often forget. Power doesn't always come from shouting. Sometimes it comes from enduring. So when the judge mocked his accent, when the camera zoomed in, waiting for him to stumble, when the courtroom laughed at his silence, they didn't know he had already faced something worse. They didn't know he had already chosen. And that's what made him dangerous. Not because he was unafraid to die, but because he was unafraid to live with purpose. Choosing not to take the money was easy. Living with that choice, that was the war. The morning after Traoré walked away from the Nairobi hotel room, the silence began. Not the peaceful kind, but the calculated, icy vacuum of international exile. Aid packages stalled. Investment forums quietly removed his name from invitation lists. The Regional Trade Committee, which once welcomed him as a visionary voice for Pan-African cooperation, now claimed logistical conflicts whenever he was involved. Then came the rumors. The Western press, once cautiously curious, began painting him with familiar brushes: erratic, populist, volatile. One prominent financial outlet published an op-ed titled "The Dangers of Charisma in Failing Democracies," with Traoré's silhouette shadowed beneath the headline. It didn't accuse him of anything outright, but it didn't have to. That's how reputations are unmade. Not by shouting lies, but by whispering doubt until it feels like truth. Embassies scaled down communication. Foreign legal experts withdrew offers of assistance. Even allied African leaders, facing pressure from donors, began to distance themselves. A former president who once called Traoré the conscience of the region now told journalists, "He means well, but he's too bold for his own good." And yet, through all this, Traoré never changed his rhythm. Each morning he rose before dawn, pen in hand. He wrote his own statements, read each clause of international trade agreements, annotated court filings by lamplight. Not because he was trying to win anyone over, but because he refused to let the story be rewritten without his voice present. His aides begged him to delegate. Diplomats urged him to soften his tone, to issue a statement of conciliation. Even friends asked, "What are you trying to prove, Ibrahim?" His answer was always the same. "I'm not proving. I'm remembering. Remembering why they tried to poison him. Remembering the red folder and the names it carried. Remembering the children who asked, 'If we speak quietly, will the world still hear us?' And he knew. Every day he stayed standing. They were watching. But the isolation was real. Even within his own government, cracks began to show. Advisors left. Reports were delayed. Morale dipped. People feared proximity to a man who had become radioactive to the global order. Still, he pressed on, because Traoré had accepted that resistance has a cost, not just in money, not just in reputation, but in loneliness. He walked through hallways that once rang with praise, now echoing only footsteps. His calendar grew light, his circle tighter. The red folder sat beside his desk, untouched but never forgotten, like a reminder that he hadn't imagined the truth. He had carried it. One night, a junior staffer brought him a file to sign. As the young man turned to leave, he paused and asked, "Do you ever wish you'd just taken the deal?" Traoré looked up slowly, eyes not angry, just steady. "They wanted me to stop being a problem," he said. "But if the price of peace is silence, it's not peace at all." The young staffer said nothing, but later that night, he sat down and read the entire Constitution cover to cover. He didn't know why. He just knew that something about standing next to someone who refused to bow made you want to stand straighter too. The room was quiet, save for the scratch of pen on paper. It was past midnight in Ouagadougou. The city slept, but inside a dimly lit study, Ibrahim Traoré sat hunched over a wooden desk, sleeves rolled, a single lamp burning. The air was thick, not with fear, but with focus. Line by line, clause by clause, he wrote, by hand, his closing statement, though no one had asked for one. Each word he inscribed was deliberate, not flowery, not defensive, just the truth, laid bare like bones beneath flesh. This wasn't just a legal defense. It was an act of refusal. Refusal to be misrepresented. Refusal to be erased. His aides had left hours earlier, begging him to rest. But rest was for those who expected mercy. Traoré expected none. Earlier that week, his most trusted advisor had placed both hands on the desk, leaning close. "Ibrahim, don't go," he whispered. "The court is a trap. The witnesses are paid. The judge is compromised. They won't listen." Traoré looked up, not defiant, just calm. "I'm not going," he said. "I'm appearing. There's a difference." The advisor frowned. "Appearing to who?" "To the ones who think they're alone," Traoré answered, "and to the ones who need to know that silence isn't the same as surrender." They stared at each other for a long moment. No more was said. There was nothing left to argue. By dawn, the statement was finished. Traoré stood, stretched his shoulders, and placed the final page into the red folder, sealing it with a thin leather tie. He paused, his fingers resting lightly on the cover, like a pianist before the first note. This folder wasn't just evidence. It was memory, resistance, identity. As the sun broke over the horizon, casting pale light through the shutters, an old friend arrived unannounced. "We've arranged for discreet security," the man said, nervous. "A convoy. Foreign observers. If you let us—" Traoré raised a hand gently. "No need. At least take one bodyguard." He shook his head. "They will not shoot me in front of the world." "You don't know that." "Then let the world see it." The friend went silent. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why walk in alone?" Traoré looked down at the red folder, then back up. "Because justice," he said softly, "must be seen. Not believed, not hoped for. Seen." And so he walked. No escort, no bulletproof glass, no legal team. Just one man in a dark suit, holding a folder full of facts, stepping into a courtroom built to swallow him whole. He didn't need protection. He needed witnesses. And as the courthouse doors closed behind him, millions around the world didn't know it yet, but they had just become exactly that. It didn't take days. It didn't even take hours. The collapse began mid-sentence. Judge Norman Whitaker, once hailed as the face of judicial dignity in the West, was still fumbling through a legal rebuttal when the bailiff placed a sheet of paper on his bench. The emblem at the top, U.S. Office of the Inspector General, spoke louder than the judge's trembling voice ever could. By the time the microphones captured the words, "You are hereby placed under federal investigation for corruption and obstruction of international justice," the ripple had become a wave, and that wave didn't stop at the courtroom walls. Within 30 minutes, Onyx Global's stock had dropped 18%. By close of business, it had plunged 38%, a free fall that wiped out billions in projected value and triggered panic calls across boardrooms in New York, London, and Zurich. Emergency meetings were held, emails were deleted, lawyers were called, statements were drafted, then shredded, then redrafted, but nothing stopped the bleeding. Because this wasn't just a scandal, it was a reckoning. In Washington, senators who once praised Judge Whitaker's commitment to constitutional purity suddenly discovered they had serious concerns about his conduct. One even tweeted, "If these allegations are true, they represent a betrayal of everything our judiciary stands for." The comment was posted at 2:17 p.m. At 2:35 p.m., users unearthed a photo of that same senator playing golf with Whitaker just 4 months earlier. The caption read, "My good friend Norman, a lion of the law." By 3 p.m., it was gone. So were campaign donations. Super PACs that had funded Western legal traditions yanked Whitaker's name from their donor walls. Think tanks quietly purged blog posts bearing his quotes. Political talk shows, once eager to host him on Sunday mornings, now booked ethicists and historians instead, asking, "How could this happen?" But everyone already knew how. It had happened in whispers, in access, in the soft clinking of wine glasses over closed-door deals, in panels about democracy funded by extractive companies. The only difference now was that it had been seen, on camera, in real time, by millions. And so the media pivoted, faster than anyone expected. Hours earlier, they had run with headlines like "Strongman Faces Western Accountability" and "Traoré Under Fire for Authoritarian Tactics." Now they were rewriting history as it unfolded. Explosive documents tie U.S. judge to foreign bribes. African leaders' quiet stand shakes legal establishment. How a red folder broke the silence. The change wasn't noble. It was necessary, because the audience had changed. And once the public turned, once people saw not just the crime but the cover-up, not just the man but the machine that propped him up, the narrative was no longer theirs to control. Even the media that had shaped Whitaker's persona began to dissect it. Talk shows aired old interviews, now laced with irony. One channel replayed a clip of him declaring, "Justice must be seen," just before cutting to footage of him in handcuffs. The segment was titled, "When Justice Saw Back." Journalists whispered among themselves, "What else have we missed?" Editors called for audits of past coverage. One international bureau chief was overheard saying, "If Whitaker fell, who's next?" It wasn't just a man on trial anymore. It was a system of silence, of complicity, of reputation for sale dressed up as rule of law. And that system was cracking. For decades, power had relied on one truth: that exposure was rare, and outrage even rarer. But now that formula was broken, because justice didn't just arrive in a red folder. It arrived in full view, and it would not be edited. The trial was over, but the story had only begun to echo. Thousands of miles from Washington, D.C., in the heart of Accra, Ghana, a blank university wall flickered with a projection at dusk. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, and already the crowd had grown. Students in uniforms, professors in frayed jackets, vendors selling roasted groundnuts beside their carts. They weren't watching a concert. They were watching a trial replay. There was no soundtrack, no narration, just Ibrahim Traoré placing the red folder on the polished bench. His voice, soft but firm, cut through the thick evening air. "You speak of justice as if you own it." Silence. Then came murmurs. Then hands raised to shield eyes from the light. Not to look away, but to see clearer. Inside the law faculty's lecture hall, chalk scraped hurriedly across blackboards. The topic of next week's moot court had already changed. The old case file, some dry colonial-era property dispute, was shelved. In its place, bold white letters: the red folder V. The machine, when silence becomes evidence. "I never saw a man hold power like that," said Afua, a second-year law student, as she downloaded the full trial transcript onto her tablet. "Not by shouting, not by fear, just by knowing." Others nodded. One leaned in and said quietly, "We were always told that justice needs loud voices, but he showed us something different." Another student chimed in, "He didn't speak to win. He spoke to remember." That's why it worked. By midnight, law students in Nairobi, Kigali, and Dakar were forming online groups titled #RedFolderLaw. Some began rewriting their thesis topics. One in particular, submitted by a graduating student in South Africa, bore the title, "Truth Without Permission: The Jurisprudence of Silence in Post-Colonial Courts." It didn't stop in classrooms. In a small cafe in Casablanca, a group of first-generation African diaspora students played the courtroom footage on repeat while writing spoken word poems on napkins. One line kept appearing, "They taught us to shout. He taught us silence still speaks." Art students in Bamako painted murals of Traoré, not in glory but in stillness, not with raised fists, but seated calmly, a red folder at his side, a world behind him. In Lagos, DJs mixed his voice into quiet pre-dawn radio intros, blending it into jazz loops and old Malcolm X samples. No one introduced it, no one needed to. Even in places where his name was barely known before, something had shifted. Not because he had won, but because he had shown. Traoré had walked into a courtroom without power, without allies, without protection, and yet millions watched him remain whole, unshaken, as the system that sought to break him fractured instead. For the first time, justice didn't just feel like a theory, it felt possible. Not because it had triumphed, but because someone had carried it in silence and trusted the world to hear it anyway. 3 days passed. The headlines still echoed. Commentators still speculated. But the man at the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré, remained silent. Until 7:12 a.m. on the third morning. There was no press conference, no fanfare, no self-congratulation. Just a single photo posted by a small independent Burkinabe journalist on X, formerly Twitter. It showed a sheet of paper, handwritten in black ink, laid flat beneath a mango tree. The caption read, "From President Ibrahim Traoré," 112 words, and beneath it, the message that would be quoted in parliaments and classrooms for years to come. "I did not seek revenge. I sought clarity. Justice is not a tool to punish enemies. It is a mirror to reflect who we are." They asked why I did not shout. Because truth, when whole, does not need volume. I did not win. The truth did. Those last 6 words traveled faster than any verdict ever had. Within minutes, the quote was shared across continents. In Europe, a member of the EU Parliament read it aloud during a special session on judicial ethics. In Addis Ababa, the African Union issued a rare joint resolution commending the courage shown in the face of institutional corruption. And at the United Nations Human Rights Council, a representative from Latin America stood and simply said, "I would like to begin today by entering into the record the following statement," and proceeded to read all 112 words in full. No debate followed, because there was nothing to argue. Traoré's message didn't celebrate a fall from power. It didn't gloat. It didn't accuse. It did what justice was meant to do. It revealed. And somehow that made it louder than any courtroom shouting match, louder than gavel slams or headlines. It quieted the noise. For years, people had wondered whether the truth could still matter in a world shaped by spectacle, spin, and silence bought with influence. Now they had their answer, not in a man, but in a folder, not in a verdict, but in a voice. And the truth at last could no longer be ignored or forgotten. In an elementary courtyard outside Bamako, a teacher empties a box of crayons onto dusty benches. The day's art lesson is simple. Color what courage looks like. Dozens of small hands reach for one crayon, red, and trace a humble rectangle clutched by a calm, dark-skinned figure. The red folder has become a coloring book icon. Across the Mediterranean, a Parisian overpass blooms with fresh paint. Street artists layer discarded political posters beneath a 12-foot portrait of Ibrahim Traoré, chin lifted, eyes steady, folder glowing. Tourists pose, commuters pause. No one defaces it. Beneath the image, a single stencil reads, "Truth doesn't shout." Meanwhile, in Addis Ababa, 37 nations ratify the Red Folder Principles, an intergovernmental pact pledging transparent procurement, whistleblower immunity, and live-stream courtrooms for corruption trials. The Charter's first clause bears Traoré's sentence in 4 languages. Justice must be seen. What began as one man's silent defense is now curriculum, mural, treaty. The ripple has found its tide. Committees assemble from Ottawa to New Delhi to audit judicial appointments. Law schools replace dusty case studies with the State versus Whitaker and assign essays titled Evidence Without Volume. Statisticians track a sudden surge in public requests for courtroom live streams. Downloads of Freedom of Information forms triple. At a press forum in Nairobi, a young reporter lifts a hand. "Why?" she asks a gray-haired constitutional scholar. "Didn't Traoré just raise his voice?" The old lawyer adjusts his spectacles, smiles gently, and answers, "Because he didn't need the world to hear him. He needed the world to understand him." The room falls quiet, pens hover, and for once no follow-up question is necessary. The definition of effective advocacy has changed. Future reformers realize they may not need megaphones, only irrefutable truth and the patience to let silence do the heavy lifting. Morning light spills into a primary classroom in northern Burkina Faso. Desks are mismatched, chalk is scarce, but hope is abundant. On the wall hangs a faded world map, and beside it, a laminated photo of a red folder. During civics period, 9-year-old Mariama raises her hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Teacher," she begins, "if I tell the truth quietly, will the world still hear me?" The teacher sets her book down, walks to the girl's desk, and answers without hesitation. "It will now." She lifts a battered folder, painted red by last year's class, and places it among Mariama's notebooks. Around the room, heads turn, breaths catch, and a hush settles, not of fear but of recognition. One symbol, carried thousands of miles, has arrived in tiny hands eager to keep it moving. Outside, the wind flips a page of someone's homework. Inside, the folder stays open, bright against worn wood. The lesson is finished, but the conversation, like truth itself, has only begun. This story is not just about a man or a courtroom. It's about the quiet force of integrity in a world addicted to noise. Ibrahim Traoré didn't raise his voice, yet he moved nations. He didn't fight for power, but for truth. In his stillness, he exposed everything that was broken without ever needing to scream. That's the power of dignity, measured, focused, and unshakable. It reminds us that justice doesn't always wear a robe or hold a gavel. Sometimes it walks in with nothing but a folder and leaves with a legacy. In a time when so much is shouted and so little is heard, maybe silence, when rooted in truth, is the loudest voice of all. What about you? Have you ever chosen to stay silent? Not out of fear, but out of strength? This story is a dramatized narrative inspired by real public figures. Ibrahim Traoré, Judge Whitaker, and all individuals mentioned are real people whose actions and public personas have shaped contemporary discourse. While the dialogue and settings have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes, the emotions, questions, and issues raised reflect genuine societal conversations. Thank you for watching and reflecting with us. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think, please consider subscribing to Captain of Truth. We bring real people, real tensions, and real turning points to life, one story at a time. Subscribe now. Your curiosity fuels the next story.